Thank you so much for joining us. So hopefully you're in the right place. If you've logged on, you're here to see our webinar, Planning Your Next Nonprofit Campaign with Intention. I'll just kick off with introductions. I'm presenting Shelley Mayer. I'm the president of RAMP Communications. Just to give you a little bit of background about RAMP before we kick it off, and David introduces himself. We founded RAMP 7 years ago, and our real focus is social impact, branding, and marketing, but in particular with a lens on strategic and creative services. So really developing communication campaign strategies, and putting that creative framework or that strategic framework around all the work we do is really key to our work as an agency. And we've noticed over the last couple of years, as we've been working with clients like yourselves, we've noticed that this is something that usually we explain our strategic framework. It's quite enlightening. So that was something that we find a lot of our clients benefit from, and that we thought would be good to bring forward as a topic for the webinar today. So that is my intro, and I'll just pass it over to David, and he's going to introduce himself as well.
Yeah, good afternoon. I'm David Browett. I'm the creative director here at RAMP. I work with Shelley and the team to work on strategic content as well as oversee the creative for the agency. Thanks for joining us today. I think there's going to be some really good enlightening conversation, and we're happy to share with you our approach to strategy, because we often find that the strategic element of campaign planning is often either an oversight, or it's not even understood why it's necessary. So just to take a look at what we're going to be talking about today, we're going to touch on why strategy matters, because I think that's a really good place for us to start. You know, the need for strategy, not only why it matters, but why it's an essential element to really any campaign or any marketing initiative. We're also going to share with you the framework that we use to really get to the insights that make an effective strategy really work and really be powerful and inform the creative product at the end. And then thirdly, we're going to show you a couple of real-world examples where we've applied our framework and our strategic research and insights, and we'll show you how it actually works in a couple of examples towards the end of the hour that we have together. So why does strategy matter? It's, the strategic phase is really the underpinning of any project. Yet, as I said earlier, it seems that it's a phase that's either skipped or it's not given its due. People don't understand the importance of why the strategy is important. There's a lot of reasons for this that we've heard, in our experience. Sometimes, people say, well, we just have to get something out there. We've got to get something out into the marketplace right away. And so the process is rushed, and the strategic part of it is sort of pushed to the wayside. Another example is, we've heard people say, well, someone had a great idea, and so we want to run with it. It's probably a great idea, but if it's not informed by a strategy, it's not going to live in the right context. It's not going to necessarily talk to your audience in a way that is the most compelling. Some people say, well, our competitors have done something, so we're going to do something as well. We're going to do the same thing, or we're going to do the opposite thing. Again, without it being informed by a proper strategy, you're kind of not going to have an effective campaign. And then another thing we hear sometimes is, we just need X. We need a brochure. We need a website. Well, without strategic planning, maybe you don't really know. Maybe you don't need a website. Maybe you need something else. So the strategic part of this really supports everything that you see along the way. So we've actually distilled down, for the sake of this purpose, for the purpose of this this presentation, into four key categories. So one is that it's a roadmap. It also provides context. It builds an agreement, and then you build creative at the end of that. So I'll talk about each one of those individually. A roadmap, I think, is a great example, or a great, oops, sorry. A roadmap is, I think, a really good kind of symbolism for what a strategy is, right? You want to get from A to B. You're in a certain state, you're in a certain position, and you want to change that. So you need to build out a roadmap to get from A to B. That's pretty straightforward. The other important thing that a strategy will provide insight for is the context. And by that we mean, like, what's the lay of the land that you're going to be heading into? What's the, why are you doing it? What's happening in the environment where your messaging is going to live? Why will people at the other end care about your message? All of those things have to be considered before you even think about creating a message. And that's all part of why strategy matters. Now, in terms of agreement, I don't think I can stress this enough. Stakeholders, decision makers need to be in as part of the strategic phase of any campaign. And the reason for that is you're going to be building creative. You're going to have a creative output at the end of it that is built on strategy that you've built. So the stakeholders need to understand that, so that when you get to the final stage of an initiative or a marketing communications piece, you can point to the strategic document and say, this is what we agreed to, this is where we want it to go, this is where it's going to live, and this is why the creative that we've done answers all of those elements. So you can see why if you just go to creative without all of that sort of putting up a job, you don't really, your chances of the creative achieving what you want it to do is really almost like throwing darts. So you need all that basis and that foundation to build creative through strategy, and that's really why strategy matters. And so we approach this through what we call our strategic framework.
Thanks, David. I think that sets this up really well. So I'm going to take you through the strategic framework now at this point. But just before I show you what that framework is, a little bit of context. As David said, I mean, we use this framework for all the reasons that he just mentioned. It really informs, when we work through this strategic framework, it helps us build what we refer to as the creative brief that the team then uses to come up with creative, do their ideation and come up with creative options. Over the years, both myself, others from our agency have worked with a number of different strategic frameworks. There's a few different models out there. This is one that we've sort of, I guess, I don't want to say mush together, but really taken what we think are the best elements from various different creative strategies, approaches, or frameworks that we've worked on over the years, and really built out our own framework. So we'll show you the whole thing now, but then I'm going to break it down piece by piece. So I'm not going to talk about each of these pieces, but this is just on this slide. You can see where we're going with this, and what the whole thing looks like when it's built out. So I'll dissect all of these different elements piece by piece, and by the time we get through it, we'll be back to this full picture. So the first thing that we note is why now. This is that really important context piece. So we look at what has been happening in your environment that has really created need to produce this piece of communication, or run this campaign right now, or do this project as we're envisioning. So what is the impetus for the project? Why are we doing it? That is a really important thing that we want to understand. And also, what are the goals and desired outcomes? So what do we hope to achieve with this project? Because also understanding your goal, and I say, goals and desired outcomes in the plural, but as we'll also speak to, the more you can refine down to a very specific goal and outcome that you'd like to achieve, the better. So I would encourage you to not talk about the 15 goals that your organization has, but really, what is this piece of communication that you're building, what is the goal of this piece of communication, and try to narrow it down to one specific goal or outcome that you want to address. So that's kind of the first place, is understanding the context. So from there, we move to the first of our 3 circles, which is our product or service truth. And this might be organization as well. This is really essentially, what is your unique selling proposition? What is true about your current product or service? What do you know? What are all of the different features and benefits that you can think of for your product? And thinking about where does your product or service or organization really excel? And also, where does your product, service, or organization really fall down? What are some of the weaknesses? It's always good to look at that as well, and understand the truth on all sides, because we want to ultimately figure out what our unique selling proposition is. And I would also encourage you to consider not just the sort of rational benefits that we often lead to when we're thinking of these features, but also think of the emotional benefit that your product, service, or organization creates for your target audience. So think of as much as you can about your product and your service or your organization, and really get a good understanding of that. So the next bubble that I'll talk about is the red one, the category. And in the category, by category, we really mean the environment in which you're operating. And depending on the type of organization that you are in, this is going to be different. So, in a standard product marketing, your category would be whatever category your product is. So if, for example, you're a cell phone producer, then you're operating in that mobile device category, for example. But oftentimes when we're dealing with nonprofit organizations, as I believe most of those on this call are from, our category is a little bit broader than that. It might be the type of health charity we're working in. It might be looking at the charitable landscape. If you're a charity and you're trying to raise money, it can be looking at the charitable landscape in general and who else is out there raising money for similar causes. If you're a member-driven organization, then it might be looking at what other organizations serve your members, or even as an alternative to your member-driven organization, what other organizations might be out there doing something similar. So what are basically, for your audience, what are all of the alternatives that those people may be considering? So you're thinking about this in terms of your competition, but it's not always, in a nonprofit situation, you might not always think of them as competitors, but it's others that you're competing for attention from. So you want to understand what's happening in that category, and if there, as in particular, what is being filled by others, and then what can you uniquely fill within that category that might not be currently filled by others. So that's ultimately what we're considering this particular circle for. And then the third circle that forms our little trifecta of research that we would do to bring this all together is the consumer truth. So this is we say consumer here, but you can also replace that word with audience. In the case of a nonprofit, it's not necessarily a consumer that is purchasing a product, but it may be the audience that you're trying to reach, whether it's the donor that you're trying to seek, or it's somebody using your services, maybe it's volunteers you're trying to recruit. So, think about this purple bubble as your audience. What can you learn about them? Try to get to know them more intimately. And again, in the context of your specific goals. So, and remember on the previous, when we talked about why now, we talked about what's the goal. So when you know what your goal is, a very specific audience that's going to help you reach that goal. So you don't necessarily here want to name every audience that your organization might interact with, but thinking specifically about the campaign that you're creating or the piece of communication that you're creating, who is the audience for that piece of communication? And then try to get to know them. What are they, who are they? What are they like? What motivates them? What might their, mindset be? currently? When can you speak to them? Where should you speak to them? What types of media do they engage with? How do they choose to interact? What tone and voice or language will resonate the most with this audience? So these are all some of the that you want to think about on the audience side. So that leads us to the winning proposition. So you'll see in that little center area of this Venn diagram where your product and service truth intersects with your category truth, and your consumer truth is really where you're going to find your winning proposition. So this is really emerges by looking at how these three intersect. So essentially, where there's something that your audience really needs or wants that aligns with what you best can provide as an organization, your unique selling proposition, and aligns with a gap in the category that others are not serving, then that's really where these three bubbles intersect, and that becomes your winning proposition. So when you find the link between those three things, then that winning proposition emerges. So you always then want to understand what is that real key selling feature that we're going to win on. So when we then take this much of the framework, our next task usually is to build out creative conceptual work that will answer the campaign strategy. And before our team starts that, we always think about something called creative challenge. And really this creative challenge is all about how to persuade our audience to really believe this winning proposition and take the action we want them to take. So, because we know the context, we know our goal, we know who our audience is, we know what we want them to do. For the creative challenge, we really try to isolate this to say, how are we going to get that audience to believe our winning proposition and take the action we want them to take? And that forms the creative challenge. What might be standing in the way? What might their bias be? So these are all elements that help to isolate that. When we've got this all complete, and now you see the full strategic framework built out, this helps us to build what we call our creative brief. And that then leads to the creative conceptual options that lead to real world campaigns, which David's going to speak to you about next. And I guess, David, before I pass it off to you to cover the examples, is there anything I've missed on the strategic framework that you wanted to weigh in on?
I think it's important that those three circles really are the content to get to your winning proposition. So you want to really dig deep into each of those circles as deeply as you can. So as long as those lists can be, is as long as you should make them. Really dig deep and look at what's positive and what's negative in each of those spaces for your product truth, your category truth, and your consumer truth, because it's the intersection, those common threads that really get you to a powerful winning proposition. So the more information you can fill into that space, the more accurate the winning proposition is going to be, and the creative challenge as well.
And actually, thanks, David. That reminded me of a point I wanted to make as well, is that wherever this piece of research, this can be informed by actual real life research. We've used the word truth in each of these bubbles. And so really one, I guess, misstep sometimes that can be made is where we believe we understand the truth, but we don't actually understand the truth. And so really making sure that there's appropriate consultation with stakeholders and with people that can help shed light on this truth, but that consultation is done robustly enough. And where possible, that formal actual research is undertaken to inform these things is always the very best scenario. So wanted to make that point as well.
So what does that look like then when we actually apply it to real projects? We have a couple that we're going to show you. One is a project we completed last year. Another one is actually kind of in progress still. And there's some really interesting nuances between the two projects that I think you'll find quite interesting. The first client is for OSPE, which is the Ontario Society of Professional Engineers. Do you want to set up the
Okay,
client?
yeah, sure. So we began working with OSPE a couple years ago, and when we first began working with them, the situation was really that their membership was plateauing. Actually, I think we've got a slide for this. Um, their membership was plateauing, and they were finding that further that people that were joining initially as students weren't actually signing on once their free student membership was um, expired, and so they were losing a lot, like losing members. They had quite high member attrition for an organization of their nature. As well, they weren't really attracting new members in the volume that they wanted. The Ontario Society of Professional Engineers is a member-based organization that provides services to engineers, and it is does work in conjunction with another association called PO, Professional Engineers of Ontario, which is actually the mandatory association that every practicing professional engineer needs to be a member of in order to practice. So OSPE had a bit of a road to communicate to members that the real value of joining on as a member of OSPE in addition to being a member of PO. So when they hired us, their main goal was to increase member retention and new members to the association.
Yeah, so that's the why now as part of our diagram. Do you want me to
Yeah,
continue?
yeah.
So in terms of product, service truths, and the other truths that I'll get to, it was actually quite a deeper dive than what we were going to see on the screen here, but we've sort of distilled it down for the purposes of presentation here. So their product or service truth that they offer a comprehensive package of support for members, including advocacy, networking, benefits, and more. So like many associations, they really provide I guess the backbone so that the engineers can go out and do their work. And so it was important to show that because of these product and services truths, that OSPE was really essential as part of the profession of engineering. And so then the category truths were interesting as well. As Shelley mentioned, membership is not compulsory for engineers, but the PEO certification is. So that's one of the category truths. Again, there was a lot of important information around the category truths, but again, distilled down to sort of the key message on this one is that there was some competition out there in terms of membership.
And I think just to add a little bit to that, one of the things that we found was that PO as the certification body actually doesn't, all of those product and service truths we previously mentioned, those items aren't well, in some ways some of them are offered slightly by PO. The vast majority of those supports and real advocacy for the profession and being really a representative for the engineers. Like PO's role is to protect the general public. PO's making sure that people practicing engineering are certified, have the appropriate training and education. And so they're not out there looking out to support the actual engineer themselves. They're there to protect the public and the profession. So, these kinds of supports that OSPE is providing to really help engineers succeed in the profession was something unique to OSPE that PO didn't offer.
So the third circle here is the consumer truth. And remember, the consumer here is not the general public, it's actual engineers and graduates as well from engineering schools. And what we found was around the consumers that they had low awareness of the amount of services that OSPE provided. They knew about them perhaps, but they didn't know how robust the support was. As well, engineers are dedicated to their careers. They're innovative. They care about what they do for a living, so they care about the impact that they have. We discovered that at the very core, they're not just motivated by a professional designation, but they actually care as a group, as a whole, about making society better, because engineers are sort of behind everything that you see, right? Every piece of technology, every, not just bridges, but artificial limbs and chemical engineering. Engineers are sort of at the root of everything, and by their very nature, they're keen on making a difference in the world. And so that was really good insights into what engineers are in general. And so those three product truths led to, again, our winning proposition, which is that membership supports engineers so that they can be their best. In other words, when you join OSPI, you have now a partner in your profession. And I'll say something about the winning proposition and the creative challenge. It's best if you can distill it down to one very, very clean, clear thought, like this one is: membership supports engineers so they can be their best. That's a message. That's a core single message that you can really build strong creative from. And I'll show you an example, in just a minute. Which led to our creative challenge, which is that OSPI is an essential ingredient in your career success. So when you're armed with those two insights, you can really capture the essence of and the spirit of the organization and what it means to the consumer at the end of the day.
Okay, so we're ready to see the work.
Right.
That led. Cool. So this next piece. David's going to walk you through this, but we wanted to then show you the kind of strategy that informed this, and now we'll show you where the work landed and what creative we came up with based on that strategy.
So again, the winning proposition is membership supports engineers so that they can be their best, combined with our creative challenge, which is OSPI is an essential ingredient to your career success. So what we created was a campaign where we featured engineers who are doing amazing work in their field, and there was varying fields from the environment to water to acoustical engineering, the whole gamut of the engineering field. And we photographed them, as you see here, very heroically, very confidently, with the line, "Go ahead, change your world, we've got your back." That became the overriding theme of the campaign. Now remember, this is directed not to the general public, but it's directed to engineers through engineering publication, through their own publication, through posters in schools and that kind of media. So very targeted to the specific audience. And we're telling them they can go out, do the things they need to do, and we've got your back. And then, so the structure of this was that compelling headline, and then the body copy really sort of was a tease as to what each of these individual engineers did. So it told a little bit of their story, and then directed the reader to a microsite where they could learn more about the story itself and about membership, of course, and finding out all the great things about OSPI. And then to support the campaign as well, we created a tagline, which was a tagline for the campaign, but they liked it so much that they adopted it for the whole organization. And the tagline is "Behind every great engineer." So when you combine all of those elements and you look back on the strategic part of this, which was the work that was done that provided us with the winning proposition and the creative challenge, you can see how it lines up, right? So membership supports engineers so they can be their best, and that membership is an essential ingredient to your career success. And so a series of posters and other pieces that really showcased each of these individual engineers. And in terms of art direction, it was a very ownable campaign. We shot in a certain way, certain color scheme. All of those creative decisions are made, obviously, at the end of, once you have all your messaging in place. But Also, ownership of a campaign, the way it looks, is also an important element, but that's more of the creative end of things. So the campaign led to a microsite, which you can see a small sample of on the left. There was a contest component that you see on that screen, but the microsite was very robust. It had membership information, stories could be shared, and really the whole essence of, we've got back was captured in the microsite, which led people to learn more about OSPI and then become members. Now, I talked earlier about the campaign being focused towards engineers, very targeted, but they liked the campaign so much that we actually were able to massage the message to become a more public-facing message as well, which resulted in the TTC campaign you see on the right. So that's kind of an interesting byproduct of the campaign. Strategy was built, and then it was able to be adjusted with messaging to a different audience, to a public-facing message.
But you can see how, the headline has to change for a new audience. So engineers change the world. So now we're not talking to the engineers themselves, but we're talking more to the general public. So you can see how, if the strategy from the get-go, if the why now had been help the general public understand the question of engineering, you can see how our strategic framework might have been quite a bit different and might have led to a completely different creative approach. Now, normally, what we would advocate for is, if you have a goal to communicate with the general public, we would have, in a perfect world, approached that as a new creative exercise. But in case trying to be cost efficient, which is another important thing on the nonprofit side, we looked at how we could change the communication strategy for the piece and use some of the same content, for example, the photography and the member stories. So what were the results of that campaign? So OSPI experienced in that first campaign period that their new member registrations actually increased by a rate of 45% compared to the new member registrations that occurred in the prior years. So they definitely saw a lift. And they also saw social media followers increase by 78% across all platforms. That was during the campaign and some ongoing work that we were doing on the social media side. And we would take this sort of the same strategic approach to our social media elements, which is really understanding your audience, what is the message that you want to communicate, and making sure that that's woven through all social content as well. So that's OSPI. We're just going to move on to the second example. We're almost through the content of this presentation, and then we'll open it up for some questions. But this one's kind of interesting as well. So this is a campaign that we're doing for an organization called KESPA, the Association of Adult and Continuing Ed School Board Administrators. And KESPA is really working on behalf of all the school boards across Ontario to, and this is an Ontario specific association, is working on behalf of all the school boards across Ontario to help encourage more people to go back to school and get their high school diploma. So the purpose of this campaign was to convince people to get their high school diploma. So why we wanted to show this example is this is one where some of the assumptions that were made during our initial discovery and analysis actually changed when we built draft creative concepts and tested them in market. So I think what's really helpful in this example is you can see how a winning proposition in a creative challenge in one vein can lead to one type of creative execution, and then how different the creative can be once you change that winning proposition and creative challenge. So, without dissecting the entire example, just in the interest of time, the first round of strategic work that we did with KESPA led to a winning proposition around the fact that that really high school diploma is the most accepted credential when it comes to what employers are looking for. And employers are really keen on hiring high school graduates, and that It's really, in terms of all the alternatives out there, the high school diploma is the best hope for future success, and really that it is the best choice. So the creative challenge around communicating the high school diploma as the best choice, and that really answering that challenge that consumers might not understand, with many alternatives such as different continuing ed programs they could do, community colleges, or private career colleges, and different alternatives, that people may be missing the point that the high school diploma is really important. So that was the initial strategy. So keeping that strategy in mind, I'll let David speak to a couple creative options. And this is conceptual work that we created. And should be clear, this is not a complete ad. This was pencil sketch conceptual work that was produced strictly for illustrating the concept or the idea to the client.
Right. So with the creative challenge being there is a best choice, which is your high school diploma, we really made that the focus of this first piece of creative. So the headline, "Finish your high school diploma, give yourself a future," was the sort of overarching message. And again, this is just a rough layout sketch, but the idea, this would be photographed ultimately in the end. The idea was to show a person giving themselves the diploma, handing themselves the diploma. So, for example, on the left side, we could have a person who, whose life situation has changed. Their child is now ready for school, and so she's ready to go back and get her high school diploma. And then we see her on the right in the future in a successful position because of her hard work and because of the diploma. So it was about capturing people at certain points in their lives when they would be, ready to go back, ready to get the diploma, and show them the importance of it and how that would roll out in terms of success. So that was one execution around that winning proposition and creative challenge. And then the second one was really to focus on the diploma itself. So you can, again, so it's the headline was, "It's the right piece of paper for the job." And the idea here was to photograph a setting where there would be an actual workplace setting, and the diploma, this large diploma, is actually in the room with the person as part of their skill set, as part of what's made them successful. Ultimately, they decided that this was the better course of action, and then we went out and tested this creative with the audience.
Yeah, so we did a couple things. There was a consultation step in this project because KESPA represents a variety of school boards across Ontario. There was a consultation step where we brought the work to various groups of actual school boards and asked them what they thought, and we heard some feedback from those groups. And one of the, without kind of digging into all the specifics, the one big thing that came from those discussions was a general feeling that the strategy behind this creative idea might not be pointed in the right direction. That the barrier wasn't so much that people didn't understand it was important, that there were some other barriers that might be more top of mind for the person. And that led to then actually bringing the creative to the audiences that it was intended for, and asking what were they taking away from this ad, and why had they decided to pursue, what had been a barrier to them pursuing. So we heard firsthand through focus groups, and then thirdly, we actually went out and did quantitative research, and we asked people in Ontario, do you understand the importance of a high school diploma? If you, why haven't you pursued your high school diploma? And, at the end of the day, what we found was that our strategy was actually not pointing in the right direction. What we from the research was that people actually in high numbers and we surveyed in particular people without a high school diploma, people in high numbers understood that it was extremely important, but there were actually other things standing in the way. And when we looked at all the different reasons, the things that stood in the way, a lot of it came down to fear. So we really reoriented our winning proposition around this notion that getting your high school diploma really isn't what you might be expecting. It's not what you imagine. There's many benefits to the way that these school boards are running high school diploma programs now, and without going into all the details, there's a lot of really great approaches that make it sort of not what people might expect. So, that getting your high school diploma is so much better than you imagine. And, the creative challenge was really then about convincing these adult learners to overcome their fears. So, with that in mind, David can speak to the creative that, is ultimately the direction that this campaign is now going.
Right. As you can see on the bullet points on the left, some of the fears that we established or that we uncovered was cost, right? People maybe feel that they can't afford to go back because they don't know really what the truth is. Time, do they have enough time in their schedule? Scheduling was an issue, certainly. The idea of going back with with teens again was another element that there was some fear around. So we were able to kind of create these myths that people felt were true but weren't true, and we developed a digital campaign that was able to address each of these fears and more. There's a longer list than I am showing you here, but just to get the idea of the kinds of fears that people were facing. So what you're seeing here is the first panel of a digital ad that would rotate, and each opening frame would address one of the fears. So in this case, does finishing my high school diploma mean going back with teenagers? And you see the little icon in there, the little that's sort of, it would be animated and reflecting this angst that people have with that question, does finishing my high school diploma mean going back with teenagers? And the answer is always going to be nope. And then the reason why it won't be a problem is you'll be with adult students in this case. And then the third animation is now resolved. Now it's a happy situation. Finishing your high school diploma is easier than you think. Find out more. So it was a very clear goal to dispel these fears that people have. And it actually became quite structured in the way we were able to talk about the message. So the first panel would always be set up the fear. Second one would be to alleviate it, and the third would be to give them a call to action. So that's one execution of it. Another one. So will finishing my high school diploma be hard to fit into my schedule? Nope. There are many flexible options. And again, finishing your high school diploma is easier than you think. So important in a campaign like this too is to try and generate some recall. In the digital space, it's very, very crowded. Obviously, there's lots of noise, lots of visual noise. So you need to have some common threads in how it looks and the sort of format and structure of messaging, so that people remember it and they come back and take action.
So I think what this example really illustrates is that point that we made earlier when we took you through the strategic framework, is just that having a bit of research in place and actually making sure that the strategy is in the right place before the conceptual work. And, as you can see, we got as far as pencil sketches. So luckily, it was the perfect time to kind of test that and make sure. In this case, there were so many stakeholders. So it was very difficult to kind of, I guess, take the brief out through all of the different stakeholders and test it at the brief level. But ideally, you'd want to be testing at the strategic framework level before you even get into creating conceptual work. In our case, in this project, we created some initial high-level sketches, but hadn't taken it any further than that. But you can really see how a different strategy leads to very different creative work in this example. So research and really making sure that you study each of those bubbles that we showed you in the strategic framework in good, thorough manner, and that you really are not using individual kind of opinion and conjecture, but you're basing it on real truths, is really important takeaway from this example. So that takes us to our final slide, and then we'll open it up for some questions from participants. So just to summarize, really the point I just made, you want to focus on your strategy always before you start with content. Even it's surprising how many times when we're first even called into an initial client opportunity, there's already some sense of a creative idea that the client may be even feeding us, like, this is our creative idea, can you help us execute this? And we always encourage clients to take a step back before we execute a creative idea that they've initially come up with, not because we don't I guess value the quality of the creative idea, but it's like that creative idea might be based on the wrong strategy. So that's where we always say drive strategy first. Determine those motivating factors and base that on really accurate truths about your audience. Those truthful insights and real informed insights are really, really critical. You want to get buy-in from that strategy, from all the buy-in on the strategy from all the stakeholders before you create that content, so that everybody's in agreement about the direction that it's going. And then validate that strategy and creative with your audience where you can. And those are some of our key takeaways. We hope you learned a lot from this presentation. We will make the content available to those who have registered. If you'd like to stay in touch with us, some of the things that we throw out there, we have a monthly newsletter called Good Works, and if you visit our website at ramp.agency, you can subscribe to that. You can of course also follow us on LinkedIn or on any of these social channels, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or LinkedIn. And in all cases, you can find us under the handle of @RampAgencyTO. And then we'd also just like to say that for anybody that's participated in this webinar, if there is a specific initiative or project that you feel could benefit from reviewing this type of a strategic framework, we'd love to be in touch, and we could schedule a short call to learn more about your project and hear how we might be able to help with that. So that's what we'll leave you with, and just say thank you all for participating. And I don't know, David, do you have any closing thoughts?
Yes, just appreciate you spending time with us today, and hope it was helpful for you guys as well.